Welcome to Femme Furious, a podcast where pop culture meets a feminine framing. I am your host, Julia Rose Portela, and today we are diving into situationships, messy, complicated situationships. We are going to look at why we love these kind of stories and go all the way to my top 10 ranking in recent pop culture. But before we dive into today's episode, let me tell you how you can support and follow the podcast. You can, of course, subscribe anywhere that you get your podcasts. You can also watch full video breakdowns on YouTube, Substack, and Patreon. If you want community, go over to Patreon. If you want cultural analysis, go over to Substack. And of course, you can follow the podcast on Instagram and TikTok at Femme and Furious Pod. Let's unpack situationships, shall we? Situationship is a term that is so soft and so casual, it almost disguises the psychological warfare that is happening within the entire dynamic of one. Situationship is a shiny new label that we have slapped onto something that humanity has been doing since we figured out how to have feelings. It is all of those messy, undefined, emotionally ambiguous relationships where no one is entirely sure of what's happening, but everyone is deeply affected by it. It is a relationship that lives inside of a suspended connection. It's not quite friendship. It's not quite romance. It's not quite a heartbreak or a devastation, but it's usually like a combination of all three. And situationships are everywhere. They're in our real lives, in our group chats, in our therapy sessions, especially in our storytelling in modern pop culture, because we are living in an era of emotional uncertainty, and nothing quite reflects that like our obsession on a cultural level with a romantic limbo, years-long romantic limbo. Now, my 20s were spent in and out of situationships, which is probably why I am now practicing misandrist with 2 cats and absolutely 0 fucks to give in my 30s. But it has supplied me with a lot of character development. But truly, if you line up my dating history, it looks a little bit less like a romantic journey and a little bit more like those PowerPoints that people make for their friends at the end of the year to just show our internal psychosis about dating. If you don't know what I'm talking about, we have different algorithms, okay? I've built my algorithm brick by brick, and I love those PowerPoints. I think that we should have more friendship PowerPoints at the end of the year to highlight the truly wonderful / insane things that we have done over the course of a year. Despite the chaos of my dating life and despite the emotional damage, perhaps, and certainly the very concerning Spotify playlist that I definitely have had and deleted over the years, I get it. I understand the pull. I understand why we love these stories, because situationships are seductive in a way. They possess an emotional intimacy without any deeper commitments. And I think in a world where we are inundated with so much commitment, that could feel really enticing and seductive to people. If you peel back the layers of a situationship, there are some like really definitive elements involved. First and foremost, there is like an undefined or ambiguous relationship status. You're not quite dating, but you're not dating. You're not exclusive, but you're also not really allowed to ask questions about your exclusivity. And you exist in a sort of contractually gray area as far as like commitment is concerned. The second piece is intimacy. Whether it is emotional, physical, intellectual, or all three, there is some sort of connection on a more intimate level with this person. It's like, you know, their childhood trauma, you know, their favorite comfort show, you know how they take their coffee, but you don't really know what you are. So there is an emotional intimacy usually that transcends the need for a defined commitment, at least for a period of time in the relationship. And then the third thing is there's lots of tension. It is delicious. It is intoxicating. It is usually created through miscommunication, longing, yearning, years of silence or near silence. the eternal will they, won't they dynamic that has been ruining our lives since the invention of narrative structure. And that is what is existing within the scope of situationship. There is some sort of tension that keeps us in that push and pull dynamic with the other person. And we like this. We like this in real life, clearly, because people entertain situationships all the time. And we like it in stories. Because situationships let us feel very deeply without experiencing like a full vulnerability with somebody, they allow us to romanticize the potential instead of the reality. They let us live in fantasy without perceived consequence, even though there is always consequence for a situationship. And they keep us suspended in an emotional possibility, floating somewhere between hope and heartbreak, where everything is just more intensified. Situationships are often not about love, they are about anticipation, and that anticipation of the hope or the heartbreak is what is so addictive about these as far as storytelling goes. It's what makes them very traumatic as far as like real life scenarios go. So let's talk about how we got here, because romantic storytelling used to look very different. Old romantic narratives followed a very specific formula. There was a meet or a meet cute. There is conflict. There is a grand gesture. There is a resolution, and then the credits roll. So there was a very clear trajectory to the romantic narratives of the past. There was often closure, there was emotional accountability, and there was usually some sort of like rain-soaked confession scene or a sprint through the airport, right? People kissing in public, music swelling, problems resolving miraculously. Therapy was often not required. The early 2000s continued this trend, especially within their rom-coms. We were sold a very specific type of certainty. We were promised that these relationships were inevitable in some way and they were attainable. And when the couple would come together, they would be permanent. A lot of 2000s rom-coms relied on people to be charming enough to be able to attain the relationship, or persistent enough to be able to attain the relationship. And that if you could be those things, you would eventually be rewarded a soulmate who understood you and also owned a charming bookstore. Win-win. But modern storytelling has to reflect modern times where there is a lot more emotional ambiguity, especially now. So now a lot of stories follow a different type of formula, which is a meet or a meet cute, the spark or the initial connection, whether that's like a one night stand and then they don't talk or something along those lines. They kiss and they don't see each other for a while. So there's usually like some sort of sexual or romantic spark and then a period of time where there is no communication or no connection, to which then when they come back together, there is emotional intimacy and then usually a misunderstanding or a miscommunication. And then we usually get some kind of emotionally ambiguous ending on where these two people will end up. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that even though happily ever after has always been a very reliable narrative, it feels less believable than it used to, particularly for a younger or more modern audience. So this idea of like maybe someday is more perhaps emotionally fluent with a modern audience than the idea of a happily ever after. I don't know that millennials or generations younger than me trust the idea of certainty within a relationship anymore. And of course, certainty in a relationship never exists, right? You could marry somebody and find out 25 years from now that they're not who you thought they were, and that could change everything for you. Like, nothing is guaranteed, nothing is certain. But I think that for millennials and generations younger, this idea of meeting one person who is going to fulfill and check every box and is going to be steadfast and reliable feels like a big ask. We've lived through recessions, climate collapse, the uprise in dating apps, which I have friends who are married and have never had to go on a dating app and have never had to experience it, who really do not understand. Dating apps could be a whole separate episode because there's really so much going on there that, like, if you've ever had to spend 5 minutes on a dating app, I think you could lose hope for your dating life permanently. We have the rise of social media that comes into play as well. And so this, like, idea of stability in relationships feels mythical. But I think the idea of longing or yearning is something that is very enticing to a millennial generation, or again, to generations younger. And it's not that yearning wasn't there before, that it wasn't in storytelling before, because it obviously was, but the way that it's explored, I think, in relationship to this idea of situationship is really fascinating, especially now. Longing keeps your dopamine cycling. Ambiguity intensifies your, like, emotional attachment to something and makes a story, I think, more interesting because we want to know how it's going to end up. We want to see where it's going to end up instead of knowing that there's going to be a clear trajectory and this is where it's going to find its conclusion. So the lack of resolution keeps the emotional loops active and the brain craves closure. So it feeds on this anticipation of the story. And I think that's what makes some of the stories that we'll talk about today very, very rich. I think this is why we rewatch very painful stories. I think it's why we romanticize slow burns. I think it's why we fixate on unresolved couples and why we love stories about deep yearning and deep longing. Situationship narratives give us emotional stimulation without any emotional finality. For the most part, they keep us wanting, and that's good storytelling, especially in modern storytelling now, where if something is on TV or is going to be adapted to TV, you're only going to have 8 to 10 episodes, and you've got maybe multiple seasons of that. So this idea of being able to keep something open and whatnot is also just good storytelling for streaming platforms. Now, before we get to my top 10, I just want us to put on our slutty little analytical hats for a minute, okay? Because situationships are not gender neutral experiences, but through the feminist lens, because this is not a femme frame proper, we can look at how women are taught to be emotionally available, but not emotionally demanding. Raise your hand if that's ever happened to you. We have been socialized as women to soften ourselves into something that is very palatable for other people and to be patient, to be understanding, to be flexible. So it makes sense that a lot of women would find themselves in these emotionally turbulent relationships with men where they are accepting emotional breadcrumbs and calling it nourishment. Like, it's just popcorn for the heart. It's got no substance to it. Situationships reward the emotional labor without any of the structural commitment. They feed on the fantasy of, he'll realize someday how amazing I am, and he'll wake up and he'll want to commit to me. So the way that women are raised trains us to believe that the endurance that we can experience over the course of a relationship is equal to the devotion that we are putting into a relationship. And what I love about this is, if you've ever listened to Matthew Hussey, who's a relationship coach, he says that we believe that the more I do for somebody else, the more they will love me. And research has actually shown, and he talks about this all the time, that actually, psychologically, the more I do for you, the more I love you. So the more that women in particular are feeding into these situationships, the more that suffering is simply just like an entryway for our love and our connection. And then if we look at it through a queer lens, situationships take on maybe a little bit of a different texture. So longing then becomes identity exploration, emotional intimacy without any public stakes, becomes a security blanket. And you see this a lot in queer storytelling, where there is a ton of emotional intimacy, but no real public stakes because somebody is closeted, for example. There's sort of like a love before labels trope that gets played out a lot in queer media when it comes to this idea of a situationship, because these narratives become spaces of emotional freedom and emotional imprisonment at the same time. So these situationships in queer storytelling can often be very freeing for a character who is exploring their sexuality while also being an emotional imprisonment for both characters involved, because they're not really being forthright about that in a larger capacity or a public capacity. I think the question to ask is, why does that certainty feel boring? And I think it's because situationships allow us to believe that we can experience a deep intimacy with zero emotional risk, even though we are almost always the most emotionally devastated in a situationship. They last, they make an imprint. They offer intensity without any accountability. And because uncertainty is thrilling, it keeps us very alert. It keeps us emotionally activated, and it makes everything feel important. Which brings us to our top 10 situationships across pop culture. Number 10, Kelly and Ryan from The Office. Kelly and Ryan are the blueprint for toxic situationships. They have a lot of chaos and they have a lot of passion and a lot of emotional whiplashing over multiple seasons. We watch them orbit each other in a cycle of attraction, passion, making out at work, denial, reconciliation, emotional warfare, professional sabotage. And in this situationship, Kelly is deeply emotionally invested in their commitment. And Ryan is perpetually emotionally evasive. He refuses to label their relationship. He refuses any accountability. He doesn't really want to provide any stability. And yet they can't quit each other. They just keep going. And their messy dynamic is volatile, is professionally disruptive across the seasons of The Office, and is completely captivating. It's entertaining. You like to watch them. It's the kind of relationship that thrives on drama and self-destruction, bring out the absolute worst in each other, and yet they continue to do the dance that they are doing because you can tell that they like each other. You can tell that they are attracted to each other. You can also tell that they should be banned from interacting by several regulatory agencies. HR should have been involved a long time ago. And yet we eat it up. It's even spilled over into real life where people don't know how to define Mindy Kaling and BJ Novak's relationship in real life. Like, there is some sexual tension, some romantic tension, but they're not together and people ship them together and there's a lot of love there and you can tell that they have a deep emotional bond, but they've never been in an official relationship, at least to our knowledge. So it's like really interesting how life imitates art here, because the same, I would say it's less messy in the public eye, but definitely the same connection that we feel between Kelly and Ryan is just a mirror to the real life tension that we get between Mindy and BJ Novak. All right, number 9, Tom and Summer from 500 Days of Summer. If situationships had a patron saint, it would be this movie. Tom and Summer are not in a relationship. They are definitely in some kind of emotional entanglement where Tom projects his idea of a perfect romance and a perfect woman onto Summer, who is very clear about not wanting commitment. And yet, emotional intimacy ends up developing between the two. They have routines, they have shared vulnerability, they create a fantasy of togetherness. But the iconic expectations versus reality scene captures the heartbreak of a situationship so perfectly. Like, truthfully, I really think that this should be required viewing before anyone downloads a dating app. This story is the epitome of how intimacy intersecting with ambiguity can really distort our perception of love, and how a projection can become an obsession and not a reality. And truthfully, every single time that the expectation that Tom places on the relationship does not come to fruition, does not match the reality, not just in that one scene, but across the span of the movie, Tom reacts poorly or retaliates, which is obviously not healthy. This is not how relationships should work. You should not be reacting poorly to your partner not living up to a fantasy that you have created in your head that they are unaware about. It's not that the expectation doesn't meet the reality. It's that Tom's expectations of Summer are fantastical. They are relying on the fact that the two have a lot of shared interest, but shared interest doesn't create a beautiful, loving, long-lasting relationship. And that's what Tom has to sort through over the course of this movie that I think Summer is already much more aware of, as women tend to be. And it reminds us, I think, that chemistry is not compatibility. But damn, if it isn't one of the most beautiful movies that I love to revisit and that I thought was such an incredible love story when I was a young babe that I have watched in adulthood and been like, you got this wrong. It's a situationship. Let's rewind the narrative. It's definitely not a love story, which is how I thought of it when I was much younger. And now I can see the truth, which is just how longing is not love. All right, number 8, when Harry met Sally, Harry and Sally's relationship. This is the slow burn to end all slow burns. Their relationship spans 12 years of friendship, attraction, denial, longing, miscommunication, emotional restraint. You know, they develop a friendship. Their friendship begins by Harry exclaiming that she's attractive. They go on to date other people, but they support each other through these heartbreaks as friends. They build a deep emotional intimacy before ever crossing a romantic threshold. I mean, I'm sorry, but I think one of the most romantic things that you could do is be on the phone in different places in the world watching the same movie together. They're watching Casablanca on TV and discussing it while they're watching it because they can't be physically together in that moment. And I think that that is the most romantic thing that happens over the course of this movie. It's one of my favorite parts of it. But when they do finally get together, it detonates their entire dynamic. They have a one night stand. It ruins everything. Their friendship is completely disintegrated because there has been a very loose thread of their attraction holding that friendship together over the course of the years. And now that they've had sex, it like takes away the falsity of what the friendship even was. Do they end up together? Yes. Is this a love story? Yes. But it takes 12 years, countless conversations, devastation and silence, and one very iconic New Year's confession before they can come together. This is a story that understands that emotional tension is often more compelling than emotional resolution, and that yearning creates the narrative of electricity and chemistry. And the longing that exists between Harry and Sally stretches over time and ends up deepening their connection. But it is all of that yearning wrapped up in we know each other on a deep, intimate level, and we do things that couples do without being a couple. And why is that? To the recognition that when you want to spend the rest of your life with somebody, you want the rest of your life to start as soon as possible. That trajectory is great for me. I love that their situationship ends up in a happy marriage. Number 7, Sam and Sadie in Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow. Sam and Sadie's relationship also spans decade, a common thread in situationships in real life and in storytelling. They have childhood trauma. They meet at a hospital. They are there for different reasons, but they do have this like shared childhood trauma together. They develop a friendship. They develop a creative partnership, a professional partnership with much professional success and a lot of pressure in their professional careers. They have a deep emotional entanglement and a profound connection, and yet Sadie loves Sam in a way that is platonic, and Sam loves Sadie in a way that is unrequited. And so it's not quite the same. They're sort of ships in the night, and Sam is constantly working through his feelings about Sadie, and Sadie is hyper aware of Sam's romantic feelings for her. And yet their bond is intense and it's layered and it's deeply complicated. And despite all of the nuance in there, romance doesn't ever become their truth, not in full. And so I don't know if this is necessarily like the right choice for a situationship. I include it because there are romantic threads, though they're never really developed or acted upon because Sadie goes on to be with other people, and especially her relationship with Marks, which complicates everything between Sam and Sadie and their professional careers so much more. But I would say that this is a story that has a lot of emotional intimacy without any romantic fulfillment. It is about loving somebody deeply while knowing that you will never fully have them, which is how Sam navigates a good portion of this book. It is about navigating jealousy and longing and grief inside of a friendship that, for at least one of these parties, wishes was something different, wished was a different container. So it's a very tender story. It's one of my favorite books. It is very heartbreaking and it explores so many themes, but it is up there for situationships number 7. Okay, number 6. Tashi, Art, and Patrick in Challengers. This is a love triangle soaked in sweat, rivalry, and desire. There is a lot of unresolved tension between all of these characters. And you've got best friends, you've got lovers, you've got competitors, you have emotional warfare disguised as professional ambition. But the situationship is between all three characters. So you have Art and Patrick, who, for a good portion of their life, play as doubles. So they play tennis together on the same side, and they're really good at it. They're a dynamic duo. And then when Tashi enters the picture, it brings up a lot of their own unresolved feelings for each other in a romantic capacity, and Tashi helps to facilitate that. So we get the scene that's very famous. You've probably seen a meme of it online where it's like Zendaya pushing their heads together. And in that scene, it starts as a three-way kiss, but it results in Zendaya or Tashi taking herself out of the kiss, and Patrick and Art continue to make out. And so they let you know that the points of this triangle are touching in every corner. So there's a lot of jealousy when a trio becomes a duo in any capacity. The duo originally being Art and Patrick, and then Tashi putting it out there that she'll date whoever wins whatever tennis match. And then the relationship becomes between Tashi and Patrick, and the jealousy that Art experiences on being on the outside of it because he has romantic feelings for both Patrick and Tashi. And then, Tashi's marriage to Art and the emotional devastation that comes to Patrick over that, and what he's willing to do to get back into this dynamic with them, and what that means, come the end of the movie, which again sort of ends in this like ambiguous space where these characters would probably all have just been much happier and less petty. They thought about entertaining a throuple, which is what they need to be in. That's the container that fits for these people. This is like a situationship in its most feral form. There is emotional and physical entanglement without any clarity. There's literally no closure. There's no peace. There's just a lot of sweat and a lot of sexy vibes. Okay, number 5. Marco and Isabel from Night Circus. Night Circus is one of my favorite books. Actually, it's not one of my favorite books. It's my favorite book. I love Night Circus so much. I do a read of it annually. It's like a text that is so important to me. It's fundamental to the DNA of my soul. And the older I get, the more I realize that hell hath no fury like a woman scorned, and how Marco and Isabel's connection really, truly influences the entire fabric of the Night Circus. For a majority of his life, all Marco has is this man who doesn't really have a name. We can call him Alexander, we can call him the man in gray, but gets adopted by this man, has no family, was in an orphanage beforehand, and, doesn't have a name himself. He asks Alexander, or the man in gray, like, well, what will you call me? And he's like, names aren't even important. So, like, the most basic thing that we could have to humanize us, he doesn't even get in the scope of like the one connection that he has in this world. He's literally raised for a singular purpose, which is to be a champion in this test of magics that we don't understand, that they don't understand. No one understands this. Marco doesn't understand the rules of this game. He's just put into the game. And when he's finally an adult and he has finished his studying, he lives alone with very few visits from Alexander. And he is emotionally isolated and he's lonely. He's starved for connection. And so when he meets Isabel, who has a relationship to tarot and is open to sort of the things that Marco is doing, she becomes an emotional anchor for him because he has nobody else. So, sure, he's attracted to her, but really it's just a situation of convenience for him. And this relationship spans years and becomes very long distance. And because it's long distance, because Isabel travels with the circus and Marco is, stationed in London. So he pretty much remains there, doesn't go to the circus much unless the circus is in town in London. But because the circus travels all over the globe, they are in this long distance relationship where he gets really lazy because of the distance and he doesn't really have to break up with her. The relationship is undefined. It is filled with unspoken expectation, especially on Isabel's end, because she is his eyes and ears into the circus itself, and yet his heart belongs elsewhere. And by the time he tells Isabel, the emotional debt is so catastrophic. It leads to the crux of this story and really dives into this idea of how emotional avoidance becomes cruelty over time. And that's why I love it, because in the end, her actions actually become his salvation. So he can be with the woman that he truly loves, but he drags this relationship on with Isabel for many years without, sort of keeping her at arm's length, without ever defining it or claiming her or giving her any of that emotional commitment that she desires, because he has gone and fallen in love with somebody else. And because he doesn't have to deal with Isabel on a day-to-day basis, he doesn't deal with the relationship at all. And it's very heartbreaking, but it's a really great story overall. So I love their sort of initial connection and what they provide for each other and the safety and security that they develop in their undefined relationship, and how that spans, again, many, many years, and how their relationship changes over those years. At number 4, we have Buffy and Spike from Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Shame, desire, redemption, obsession. Spike and Buffy's relationship is a masterclass in tension. Their connection evolves slowly, painfully, messily. It's first, straight up enemies, to a very reluctant allies, to something akin to friendship, to something that develops into something more. First on Spike's end, then on Buffy's end. There's an episode of Buffy at the very end of season 5 where Spike is responding to the end of that season. And I think it's one of my favorite performances. I'm like, wow, just the love pouring out of his heart. But this idea of the exploration of what it is to be heartless versus what it is to be soulless, or cruelty as a love language between both of them, is really fascinating to me. Buffy constantly wrestles with her attraction to Spike. Spike wrestles with his humanity and what Buffy is pulling out of him. Their dynamic is loaded with guilt and shame and emotional denial, but watching Spike oscillate between love and resentment while watching Buffy struggle to accept her desire and the shame that is wrapped up in her complicated and nuanced feelings for Spike is really quite fascinating storytelling over the last couple of seasons. Do I think that we will forever be robbed of their full romantic potential because Joss Whedon is the villain of Buffy from season 1 to season 7 because he wanted to tell a very specific story, which is his right, but because of the way that TV operated at the time, you're getting fans' feedback in real time. uh, you know, Buffy and Spike is born of fanfics. Maybe not, but certainly born of the fans' desire to see these two people together. They wanted a romantic entanglement between these two people. That was born from traction amongst the fandom. And as is Joss Whedon's style, to give us something that we want in a way that we really don't want it. That is what happens with Buffy and Spike. I really think that Spike's lover boy potential is way underplayed with his relationship with Buffy. And I think it makes it confusing for people on where their emotional connection could be. But even into the very last episodes of Buffy, Buffy is like, that's my vampire friend. Like, she's so embarrassed and ashamed of this feeling and connection that they have. And I think that's what makes it really good storytelling, even though Spike's been around since season 2 and they've been having sort of romantic tension since like season 4. Yeah, I will always feel that we are robbed of their full romantic potential. Okay, number 3, Connell and Marianne from Normal People. Another relationship that spans years, because this is obviously a theme in situationships. We can't just like have a short dalliance. It needs to span at least a decade or it doesn't count for situationship purposes. This story is drenched in shame, particularly class anxiety, emotional miscommunication, unresolved longing, missed opportunities. These two people, Connell and Marianne, orbit each other across years. They never fully align. They are always missing the emotional timing by fractions of a second. That's dramatic, but truthfully, they are just constantly missing it. Their love is very real. Their connection is quite profound, but their emotional wounds keep them trapped in a cycle of misunderstanding, and particularly driven by Connell's fear of what other people will think, since he's athletic and like built and Mr. Popularity, and Marianne is not. She's poor and is often described as intimidating. Their relationship spans many years, but even the end of the story remains ambiguous. There's no fairy tale resolution. There's no neat closure. We don't really know whether these two characters are going to be together or whether or not they're going to be okay. It's just possibility, which feels really honest. And to be honest, if this happened in real life, these two characters probably would have broken up or moved on their merry ways. So I think the fact that it is ambiguous and that there is no clarity at the end of the story feels very true to the reality of a situationship to me. All right. Number 2, Ruby and James from Maxton Hall. There is academic tension, class disparity, there is secret longing, there's emotional restraint, there's tension, yearning, all that stuff. Ruby and James, all the good things that we love in a situationship story. Ruby and James exist in a slow burn emotional space where their desire for each other simmers beneath stolen glances and moon-eyed staring contests. Truly, if you've never seen the show, you've never seen people make heart eyes with their eyes the way that these two people do. The eye acting in this TV show is fucking phenomenal. There's a lot of nonverbal communication happening that really suggests their longing and the depth of their connection. Their connection is very intense, but it is hidden, which causes Ruby a lot of pain and a lot of self-doubt. And this longing is often turned into a spectacle in some way, particularly on Ruby's behalf. There's 2 seasons of the show, and season 1 is a lot about that, fine line between hate and sexual tension. And the second season is a lot about how long can a relationship remain secret if it's true and if it's real. So a lot of romantic suspense and a lot of like, we want to be together, but we really don't know how to make this thing work. And I think that that's really good storytelling for situationship purposes, particularly season 1 is really, really good at it. And then last but not least, this is probably recency biasy, but Shane and Ilya from Heated Rivalry, 12 years of secret hookups, 12 years of emotional avoidance, 12 years of unresolved feelings for the other person, the Mount Everest of all situationships. They have fake names in their phone contacts, like, hey, I'm going to put you in as Jane so no one suspects what we're doing here, and you're going to put me in as Lily so no one suspects what we're doing here. They have a hidden relationship, a professional rivalry. There's a lot of stolen glances, a lot of secret rendezvous. There's emotional denial that gets turned into like a performance art when they are playing hockey, particularly when they can finally be on the same team, on the all-star team. They get this kiss on the helmet. It's like the first time that they can publicly display any affection that's not hatred for each other because of the narrative that was placed on them. Not one that they ever wanted to be in, just like how people perceived them and how the MLH and the show, but the NHL, in what we would call real life, the parameters that the league puts around their dynamic and the relationship. And so the fear that they have, not just to be in this hyper masculine sport and to be queer in this hyper masculine sport, but then on top of it, they have a narrative that they did not even choose for themselves that gets placed on them. There's a quote from the end of their juniors where they're shaking hands at the end of that series and says, "We were supposed to stand alone at the top, but we will always be there together. We will keep climbing until no one else can reach us, but it will always be together." And this is how their relationship is described, that it doesn't matter that I got drafted number 1 and you got drafted number 2, because we are always going to be number 1 and number 2, and we're going to consistently rise and we're going to consistently do it together. I'm only as good as you are, and you are only as good as I am, because we're going to keep pushing each other. And that tension between them spills over into their sexual attraction. And, then we get this beautiful, infamous tuna melt seat where, after many years of doing this dance, Ilya soft launches the idea of domesticity and what it would be like to be in an actual relationship. And Shane hard rejects it, freaks out, goes and, gets into another relationship. And then finally, when that dissolves and he's ready to admit that he is fully gay and that he has feelings for Ilya, goes out of his way to invite Ilya to the cottage, to make sure that when Ilya comes, that there's that same level of domesticity, makes things comfortable, gets food so we don't have to leave, like as comfortable as it can be for this person. And so this is a story that sometimes longing and yearning can sustain entire narratives, because that's what we love about the story. But the tension is more compelling perhaps than the resolution, and how when two people then come together in a multiple story arc, how do we then maintain that tension when it's no longer a will they, won't they? Are they going to just be in a relationship or are they not? And so the yearning is like its own form of intimacy here between the characters and between us yearning for the rest of the story, as it should be, because situationships are mirrors. They reflect our fears and our vulnerability, our distrust of permanence, our craving for intensity, and they help us have a little bit of a brain break where we see that other people's relationships are maybe just as fucked up as our own, and then we feel good for a fraction of a second about it. And on that very emotionally destabilizing note, I will see you next episode on Friday, where I will be interviewing author Trisha Copeland about her novella of Witches and Vampires. We talk about the larger universe that she has created in her works. This is like a prequel to a prequel. And then I will be back on Tuesday. We are doing a little quickie for XO Kitty season 1 because season 3 is about to come out. So we'll do season 2 somewhere in March. So we're doing season 1. I have another interview with an author the next Friday. And then I just want to share that starting March 3rd, we are doing Binding 13, chapters 1 through 10. So I would really love, if you've never read the book, read along, read chapters 1 through 10. This is one of my favorite books, one of my favorite series, The Boys of Tommen. I can't wait to dive in with you. And until then, happy belated Valentine's Day and stay toxic.